April 3, 1987, Geneva. Sotheby's has erected specially constructed marquees on the shore of Lake Geneva, just outside the Beau-Rivage Hotel, and roughly 1,000 bidders have crowded inside to buy what's left of Wallis Simpson. The catalog is 306 lots, profusely illustrated, compiled by John Culme and Nicholas Rayner. Its official title runs to 30 words: The Jewels of the Late Duchess of Windsor, sold for the benefit of the Pasteur Institute. Before the sale opened, the house offered a conservative public estimate of $7 million. A Sotheby's representative, slightly more bullish in a March preview, said he wouldn't be surprised if it brought $15 million or more. By the time the gavel fell, 311 pieces had sold. The total, once buyers' premiums and commissions were added, $50.3 million, a world record for a single-owner jewelry collection. More than 3 times the house's own optimistic private estimate, more than 6 times what anyone had said publicly. The woman who'd owned all of it had died 11 months earlier, on April 24, 1986, in a Paris townhouse in Neuilly. She was almost 90. Her husband had preceded her by 14 years. The British establishment that had spent half a century insisting she wasn't royal enough to matter had, in the space of 2 days on the shore of a Swiss lake, watched the world pay $50 million to disagree. Her name was Wallis Simpson. And if you want to understand who she actually was, what that marriage cost, and what it bought, you don't read the biographies. You look at the jewelry. Every piece that went under that hammer was a primary source, dated, engraved, commissioned to say something specific about a specific moment. The collection is, object by object, the most honest account of the Windsor marriage that exists, more candid than any memoir, more precise than any biography, because the objects can't revise themselves after the fact. The engravings are permanent. This is what they say. Bessie Wallace Warfield was born in Baltimore in 1896. Bessie Wallace Warfield was born in Baltimore in 1896, the only child of a father who died of tuberculosis before she was a year old, leaving her mother to navigate the particular genteel poverty of a well-connected American family with no money. She grew up understanding that her social position was real but precarious. She had the right name for certain rooms, but not the resources to stay in them indefinitely. By January 10, 1931, she was at a house party in Leicestershire, and the Prince of Wales arranged to meet her. He kept arranging to meet her afterward. By the time his father died 5 years later, Wallis was on her second marriage, to a shipping executive named Ernest Simpson, and was the organizing fact of the prince's emotional life in ways that people in the appropriate social circles had been quietly aware of and hoping would resolve themselves for years. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional royal consort way. She was angular, sharp-featured, impeccably dressed, and possessed of a social intelligence that contemporaries consistently described as exceptional. She was funny. She read people accurately. She was, by every account from people who knew her in the 1930s, the kind of person who made others feel she was genuinely interested in them, which is its own distinct form of power. What she wasn't, and what the British establishment couldn't get past, was appropriate. Twice divorced, American. Not aristocratic by any standard the firm recognized. When the question of marriage became unavoidable in late 1936, the objections were constitutional. The Church of England didn't permit the remarriage of divorced people with living former spouses, and Wallis had 2 living former spouses. But the constitutional objections and the social objections were so intertwined as to be functionally inseparable. Parliament and the palace and the church all had different technical reasons for the same answer, which is a very efficient way to make sure the answer doesn't change. She became, in the public imagination of 1936, the woman who took the king. the American divorcee who had somehow inserted herself into the succession and then derailed it. That narrative was fully formed by the time the abdication happened in December, and it never fully loosened its grip. What it missed, what it was specifically designed to obscure, was that the man in question had made a series of deliberate choices with open eyes, beginning years before the crisis, and that the woman he was choosing was making her own choices too, ones that carried their own costs and their own specific acts of defiance. The jewelry is where those choices are recorded, not the official account. The pieces commissioned by a man who still wore a crown when he first went to Cartier to have an emerald engraved. Piece 1. The Wee Emerald. When his father, King George V, died on January 20th, 1936, Edward became King Edward VIII at 41. He'd been in love with a married American woman for 5 years. He had no intention of stopping. The British press, operating under an informal collective blackout, hadn't published a word about Wallis to its domestic readership. The American press had been running the story for months. In Britain, the public simply didn't know their king was navigating something that would end his reign before the year was out. On October 20th, 1936, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin came to see Edward personally. The subject was the relationship with Mrs. Simpson. Baldwin's message was unmistakable. The government wouldn't support a marriage. There was no constitutional path that led where Edward wanted to go. He'd been hearing versions of this for years, from various directions. And 7 days after Baldwin's meeting, he went to Cartier. On October 27th, 1936, 6.5 weeks before the abdication, Edward proposed to Wallis Simpson with a ring designed by Jacques Cartier himself. The stone is a 19.77-carat rectangular emerald from Baghdad, set in platinum with baguette diamond flanking stones. The weight alone is significant. A nearly 20-carat emerald isn't a subtle object, and it doesn't pretend to be. The cut is a rectangular step cut, which means the stone faces up with the full depth of its color visible, that deep, saturated green the best Baghdad emeralds produce, and that almost nothing else in the gem world replicates. When Cartier's craftsmen finished that stone in the 1930s, it was already the kind of thing you noticed from across a room. None of that is what makes the ring significant. Turn it over. On the interior band, engraved in the gold, "We are ours now, 27 times 36. The numbers encode October 27th, 1936, the proposal date. The times reads as the Roman numeral for October. Straightforward enough, as a cipher goes. But "we" is doing two things simultaneously, and the couple knew it. It stands for Wallis and Edward, their intertwined initials, a monogram they'd deploy across multiple pieces in the collection. A separate Cartier heart-shaped brooch in the estate features the initials W.E. in emeralds, flanked by a pair of X's in blood-red rubies. The monogram appears on brooches, bracelets, and rings throughout, a recurring signature commissioned across different houses and different decades. And "we" is also just the word "we." We are ours now. 6 syllables that say, whatever the empire decides, the two of us belong to each other. The ambiguity, the monogram that's also a declaration, may be a coincidence of the alphabet. Given that the couple used the same double meaning deliberately across dozens of pieces over 35 years, it almost certainly wasn't. When that engraving was cut on October 27th, the British public still had no idea Wallis Simpson existed as a political problem. The press blackout didn't break until December 3rd. The abdication itself was still 6.5 weeks away. On the surface, the autumn of 1936 was unremarkable. A new king settling into his role. Inside that apparent normalcy, Edward was at Cartier, having a 19.77-carat Baghdad emerald engraved with a private covenant. The WE emerald isn't a reaction to the abdication. It's the declaration that made the abdication inevitable. Edward wasn't recording what he'd given up. He was recording what he'd chosen. Wallis wore the ring for 22 years without changing it. In 1958, she took it back to Cartier, had it redesigned in a more modern style, and reset in yellow gold. A decision that reflects someone updating how they carry something, not abandoning what it means. She kept the engraving intact. The stone that had been set in platinum when she was 40 was set in yellow gold when she was 62. The words inside didn't change. Piece 2. The Van Cleef and Arpels Ruby Suite. The engagement ring tells you what Edward was feeling on October 27th. To understand what was happening in the months before that, when Edward was still king, still performing the full apparatus of monarchy, and already conducting a second, entirely private life, you need the ruby necklace from Van Cleef and Arpels. The inscription is engraved on the interior of a necklace that forms part of a full ruby suite Edward was commissioning throughout 1936. The date? June 19th, 1936. The text: My Wallis from her David, 19th of June, 1936. Not the king, not Edward. David. His family name for him. The name used in the household, in private, before titles. He was 5 months into his reign when he had that engraved. He still had the throne, the palace, the whole machinery of British monarchy, and he was signing a ruby necklace to his mistress with the name that said, not as your king, as yours. June 19th, 1936 sits deep in what looked, from outside, like normalcy. The constitutional crisis was 4 months away. The British press hadn't printed a word about Wallis for domestic readers. From the public's perspective, Edward was simply a new king settling in. Inside that apparent normalcy, he was at Van Cleef and Arpels, commissioning the kind of piece you commission for someone who is going to be there permanently. The bracelet from the same suite tells a different part of the story. Van Cleef and Arpels describes it as a gift made in 1936, a few months before his abdication of the British throne. The designer was a Van Cleef craftsman named Paulette. The materials: 40 Burmese rubies, the finest quality of ruby, from a source already recognized in the 1930s as producing the world's most intensely saturated red stones. Set in a design the house itself described as simple and smart. 40 rubies, simply and smartly arranged, with 2 words on the inside: hold tight. The phrase was, by multiple accounts, a specific shorthand between them, an expression Edward used in moments of pressure, an instruction that meant, don't move, don't panic, don't let go. He had it engraved in gold and sent it to her wrist because some messages can't be delivered by letter. Some instructions need to be wearable. By November 1936, the crisis that had been managed privately was collapsing into public view. Wallis's divorce petition from Ernest Simpson had been submitted in late October. The Dominion governments were being consulted. Baldwin was making clear there was no compromise available. By December 3rd, the British press blackout had broken entirely, and Wallis had left Britain for France, traveling to Cannes to stay with her longtime friends Herman and Catherine Rogers at a villa called Louviers. She was surrounded by police, dodging photographers, largely confined to the Rogerses' property. On December 7th, she issued a public statement from Cannes, saying she was willing to withdraw from the situation if it would resolve things. It was a genuine offer. Edward didn't take it. Hold Tight was sent into that specific situation as both a romantic gesture and a precise instruction from a man who had decided, some time before any of this became public, that the bracelet was the appropriate medium for the message. Don't let go. We are ours now. He'd already set it in gold on the engagement ring. He was going to say it again in the abdication chamber. The Abdication and the Letters Patent. December 10th, 1936, Fort Belvedere, Berkshire. Edward VIII signed the abdication papers, witnessed by his 3 younger brothers. His reign had lasted 325 days, the shortest of any British monarch who hadn't died in office. The following day, December 11th, he broadcast his abdication speech to the nation. The speech is famous for a single sentence in which he said he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and discharge his duties as king, as he would wish to do without the help and support of the woman he loved. It was designed to frame an abdication as a love story, and it worked well enough that the framing is still operative 90 years later. What the speech didn't mention, the decision had been made weeks earlier. On October 27th, while the crisis was still a private catastrophe, Edward had already proposed, already had the ring engraved, already committed the phrase, "We are ours now," to platinum and then gold. The abdication speech presented the choice as something wrestled from him by circumstance. The "we" emerald presents it as something he had walked toward deliberately. Edward and Wallis couldn't marry immediately. Her divorce from Ernest Simpson only became absolute on May 3, 1937. In the intervening months, they were effectively stateless, living in exile in Europe, unable to return to Britain, unable to marry, the subject of an ongoing newspaper story that was, in its most charitable version, about romantic tragedy, and in its less charitable versions, about national embarrassment. They married at Château de Condé on June 3, 1937, a privately owned estate in France, lent by a sympathetic acquaintance because there was no official venue available to them. The ceremony was conducted by a Church of England vicar, who volunteered despite the church's official position, because someone had to do it. The guest list was thin by any standard appropriate to the occasion. No members of the British royal family attended. 4 weeks before the wedding, on May 28, 1937, King George VI issued letters patent that settled Wallis's status with surgical precision. The letters patent restored Edward's royal rank as Duke of Windsor and confirmed his HRH style. His wife was explicitly excluded. Not an oversight, a deliberate construction. The document could have granted her HRH automatically. It was specifically written not to. The practical effects were relentless in their specificity. Wallis was required to curtsy to members of the royal family who outranked her, which, without HRH status, meant virtually all of them. She curtsied to women who had simply married into the family through channels the palace considered acceptable. She was formally addressed as the Duchess of Windsor, which sounds significant until you understand that the HRH in front of a name is the thing that matters in that world, and she didn't have it. In every room containing the royal family, the woman for whom the King of England had signed his abdication was positioned, by deliberate protocol architecture, below people who had done nothing except be born correctly or marry correctly. The decision is widely attributed to Queen Elizabeth, the new queen consort, later the Queen Mother, who was, by all accounts, fiercely protective of her husband's position and deeply hostile to Wallis's presence in the family structure. Edward reportedly petitioned for the decision to be reversed multiple times over the following decades. It never was. So they went to Paris, and then to the Riviera, and then to New York, and back to Paris. They built a life on the international circuit, glamorous, expensive, high-profile, and entirely outside the structure of official British life. And Edward began, systematically, to build Wallis a collection. Piece 3. The Cross Charm Bracelet. Between 1934 and 1944, Cartier assembled a bracelet for Wallis that functions as a 10-year personal archive. The piece is platinum and diamond, set with 9 gem-set Latin crosses in colored stones: sapphires, emeralds, rubies, aquamarines, amethyst. Each stone selected for a specific cross, each cross engraved with dates and inscriptions. The events commemorated include their wedding, Wallis's departure from Britain to France before the Abdication, and at least one medical procedure. 9 crosses, a decade of the Windsor marriage's most consequential years, the significant passages recorded in colored stone. The decade of its creation brackets everything, from the early years of Edward and Wallis's relationship through the Abdication, the Exile, the wedding at Condé, the letters patent, and into the Second World War. If you wanted to identify the 10 years most likely to generate moments worth preserving in gemstone, this particular decade would be a strong candidate. What the bracelet establishes is something about the habit of mind behind the entire collection. Wallis wasn't keeping a diary in a notebook. She was keeping one in platinum and colored stones. Each cross is a chapter. Each engraved date is a primary source that the official record refused to maintain. The specific gravity of this matters. Wallis had no official record. The palace had denied her a title, excluded her from protocol, and done everything within its power to position her as peripheral. There is no official royal portrait of the Duchess of Windsor in any royal residence. No commemorative medals, no institutional acknowledgement of the 35 years she spent as the wife of a former king. The official history treats her, insofar as possible, as though she happened, but shouldn't have. The bracelet is the counter-record. 9 crosses, each engraved. Their wedding, June 3, 1937. The departure to France, December 3, 1936. Events that mattered to the 2 people inside them, documented regardless of whether the palace chose to acknowledge they'd occurred. The most affecting thing about the cross bracelet isn't the design or the gemstones in isolation. It's the span, 1934 to 1944. Whoever was adding crosses to that bracelet was doing so through the Abdication, through the stateless years of exile, through the Second World War. Each cross is someone who kept going, kept counting, kept insisting that each significant moment deserved to be marked in a medium more permanent than paper. You wear a bracelet like that into every room you enter, and every room understands that you've lived through something, even if the rooms are designed to pretend otherwise. Jean Toussaint and the Language of Defiance. Understanding the pieces that come next requires understanding a woman who was, in effect, the collection's 3rd author. Jean Toussaint was appointed director of fine jewelry at Cartier in 1933 by Louis Cartier himself. She was the first woman to hold director-level power at the house in a decade when that appointment required a specific kind of authority that Toussaint had apparently made impossible to ignore. Her tenure ran until 1970, 37 years, across 3 decades of extraordinary geopolitical disruption, through which she maintained Cartier's position as the defining jewelry house of the 20th century. Louis Cartier called her La Panthère. The nickname wasn't casual. Toussaint surrounded herself with panther skins, wore panther fur coats, and brought such consistent intensity to the big cat motif that by the time of her death, the panther and Cartier had become inseparable in the public imagination. She didn't design the panther into Cartier's vocabulary because it was fashionable. She designed it in because it was hers, an extension of her own identity, translated into gold and colored stone. Then she gave that motif to Wallis Simpson, and the 2 women made something out of it together. That sustained creative partnership, which ran from 1940 to at least 1952, and produced some of the most distinctive pieces in 20th century design, is one of the more quietly remarkable relationships in the history of jewelry. The Denver Art Museum, which has studied the Windsor-Cartier connection in depth, describes the bond between Wallis and Toussaint as a very close working relationship, with the Duke involved closely in commission details. That phrasing is careful and almost certainly understated. Toussaint was a woman who had fought for institutional authority inside one of the world's most prestigious creative houses, and held it for nearly 4 decades. Wallis was a woman who had been officially excluded from the institutional markers of status, the title, the protocol position, the royal portrait. Both understood what it meant to operate inside a hierarchy that didn't naturally extend recognition to women of their particular kind. And both understood that the response to such a hierarchy wasn't accommodation. It was aesthetic excellence deployed with sufficient confidence that the hierarchy had to acknowledge it regardless of its preferences. Whether they discussed this directly, whether their working relationship extended to any shared understanding of those parallel conditions, isn't documented. What is documented is the output. Wallis reportedly co-designed at least the 1952 Panther bracelet, bringing specific intentions to Cartier's workshop, and collaborating on the process of turning them into a wearable object. Her aesthetic preferences ran consistently through every major piece: sculptural, zoomorphic, bold in color, conceptually aggressive, emphatically not the kind of thing a woman wears to represent an institution. Toussaint's design philosophy was specifically suited to this purpose. Where traditional royal jewelry of the period tended toward historically significant diamonds and pearls, pieces that represented dynasties rather than individuals, Toussaint's work was built around presence. She didn't design jewelry to represent what a person inherited. She designed it to represent who a person was. For a client who needed to establish in every room she entered that she was a person, specifically, and not merely an embarrassing footnote to a constitutional crisis, that design philosophy was exactly correct. One jewelry historian has put it directly. It was Wallis Simpson who is credited with making Cartier's Panther jewelry culturally essential. Not because she simply owned it, because she wore it with sufficient presence, in sufficient public contexts, that the Panther piece and the Duchess of Windsor became mutually defining. The object needed the woman as much as the woman needed the object. That's a rarer kind of relationship than the one where a wealthy client purchases something beautiful and is photographed in it. That's a collaboration. Piece 4. The Flamingo Brooch, 1940. In 1940, Edward was serving as governor of the Bahamas, a posting widely understood, then and since, as a polite way to keep the former king usefully occupied somewhere far from wartime Europe, and whatever complications his presence there might generate. The Windsors were in the Caribbean, attending formal government dinners, managing a colonial administration that wasn't entirely sure how to relate to an ex-monarch, and performing the social labor of an exile that had been given a title to make it look voluntary. Wartime Britain was wearing uniforms and utility clothing. London was being bombed. The Queen Consort was visiting bombed-out neighborhoods. Wallis was in the Bahamas, commissioning a flamingo brooch. It's precisely as defiant as it sounds, and the defiance was fully intentional. Under Toussaint's directorship, Cartier created the flamingo in 1940 as a specific commission for the Duchess. The bird is depicted in full movement, not decorative or static, but going somewhere. One leg engaged, wings active. Its body is built from diamonds, rubies, sapphires, and emeralds, each stone placed to suggest feather and form. The beak carries a subtle onyx detail. As a technical object, it's extraordinary, the kind of multi-stone sculptural composition that requires goldsmith's craft to function simultaneously as engineering and theater. The stones aren't merely set into a form. They're assembled into an argument about what jewelry can do when it's working at full intention. Wallis is photographed wearing the flamingo in Bermuda in 1940. She's pinned it to her shoulder, not at the center of a neckline in the conventional formal position, but high on the shoulder, where it reads from a distance as a choice rather than a convention. It's the difference between wearing a piece because you own it and wearing a piece because you're making a specific point with it in a specific room. The flamingo isn't an obvious animal for the context. It's a tropical bird, all color and motion, nothing to do with the visual language of dignified exile or formal wartime posting. But that's the function. The British royal family's formal jewelry in the same period ran to historically significant diamonds and pearls, pieces that represented lineages, that said, "I am here because of who my family was." The flamingo says something entirely different. It says, "I am here because of what I choose to look like." When Sotheby's assembled the Geneva sale in 1987, it was the flamingo brooch that became the catalog's emblem. The image on the preview materials, the single piece that stood in for the entire collection in every newspaper photograph. The editors of the sale understood which object contained the most concentrated version of what the collection was about. A bird in full movement, made of colored stones, pinned to a woman's shoulder at a formal Caribbean dinner by a woman who had been denied every official recognition except the one she was generating herself. Elizabeth Taylor purchased the flamingo at the Geneva auction. Taylor had been a close friend of the Duke and Duchess. She understood what the piece was, not just what it cost. Some objects you acquire because they're valuable. Some you acquire because you recognize what they contain, and you're not prepared to let that go to a stranger. The Panther sequence. The flamingo was a declaration. The Panther pieces that followed were a sustained campaign conducted over more than a decade, each one escalating the terms of the argument. In 1948, the Duke and Duchess commissioned the first major panther piece from Cartier, a three-dimensional yellow-gold panther with black enamel detail, its body perched atop a 116-carat cabochon emerald. The scale of that stone is worth considering plainly. A 116-carat cabochon emerald isn't a gemstone in the conventional sense. It's closer to an event. Set beneath a three-dimensional sculptural animal in yellow gold, it creates an object that exists entirely on its own terms. It doesn't reference the official canon of royal jewelry. It doesn't need to. It simply occupies the room. The commission escalated from there. A second panther piece followed, platinum and diamonds with sapphire spots, the animal set on a 150-carat cashmere sapphire, cashmere being the most coveted provenance in the sapphire world. Stones of maximum saturated blue, more intensely colored than anything from other sources. Two panthers on two extraordinary colored stones, accumulated between 1948 and the early 1950s, while the Windsors were circulating through Paris and the Riviera, and conducting the daily performance of their exile. The third piece, completed in 1952, is the one that makes the entire sequence retrospectively legible. Piece 5, The Panther Bracelet, 1952. Cartier Paris completed the Panther bracelet in 1952. The design is structurally unlike its predecessors. Where the earlier Panther pieces were brooches and freestanding objects, this one is built specifically to be worn. The body is articulated, jointed so the animal moves as the wearer moves, and engineered to encircle the wrist. Sotheby's own catalog language from the 2010 sale describes it as designed to encircle the wrist and to assume a stalking attitude. Pave set with brilliant cut and single-cut diamonds throughout, the spots rendered in calibre-cut onyx, black against white, the animal's pattern in gemstone, the markings that make a panther a panther. Toussaint designed it. Wallis co-designed it. That distinction isn't incidental, because it means the bracelet isn't something given to her, it's something she built. She brought specific intentions to the Cartier workshop and collaborated on turning them into a wearable object. The articulated panther that encircled her wrist was her design as much as it was Toussaint's. What the motif had accumulated by 1952 was specific and dense. Toussaint was la panthère, the woman who had given the animal its identity at Cartier. Wallis had become, over a decade of wearing panther pieces, the figure who made those pieces culturally essential, the woman whose social profile and aesthetic authority gave the motif its weight in international circles. The bracelet brought both of those identities together in a single articulated object, an animal that moved with her, stalking, doing what panthers do regardless of who's watching. A panther doesn't represent a dynasty. It doesn't stand for an institution or a lineage or a family connection earned through approved channels. It moves on its own terms, in its own direction, for its own reasons. In the visual lexicon of the Windsor Exile, it's exactly the right animal for a woman who had been told repeatedly, via letters patent and protocol exclusion and decades of deliberate social management, that she wasn't the right kind of person. The bracelet didn't appear in the 1987 Geneva sale. It surfaced in a subsequent Sotheby's London auction in December 2010, one of 20 additional Windsor pieces. It sold for £4,521,250. At 2010 exchange rates, that figure set a world record as the most expensive bracelet ever sold at auction. The articulated panther, stalking around Wallis Simpson's wrist at a Paris dinner in 1952, was still commanding the room 58 years later, long after everyone at that dinner was gone. Exile as a social performance. The word exile suggests deprivation. The Windsor version of Exile looked, from outside, nothing like that, which is exactly what made the official narrative so difficult to maintain. By the late 1940s, the Duke and Duchess had established themselves as permanent fixtures of the international social circuit. Paris, specifically the elegant and expensive Neuilly district, was their permanent base. A house staffed, maintained, and organized around a social calendar that included the Riviera in season, New York for the winter circuit, and the specific houses and parties that the seriously wealthy of that era used to organize their lives. Edward retained his HRH, which meant that in any room containing royalty, he still outranked almost everyone present. They were received everywhere except officially, invited everywhere except formally, given every social consideration except the one that had been specifically withheld. In this context, what Wallis wore was never incidental. The jewelry was the most public and legible dimension of a sustained argument the couple was making about their own value. Every time Wallis appeared at a Parisian dinner wearing the panther bracelet or the flamingo brooch, pieces that were emphatically not inherited, not traditional, not the kind of thing a woman wears to represent an institution, she was making a claim. The claim was that the palace's refusal to grant her a title was aesthetically as well as morally irrelevant. British royal jewelry in the 1940s and 1950s was largely diamonds and pearls, historically significant pieces representing lineages rather than individuals. That tradition carries its own genuine power. It doesn't need to be avant-garde, because its authority comes from somewhere else entirely, from centuries of accumulation and the weight of institutional history. But institutional history was precisely what Wallis didn't have access to. So what she wore instead had to perform a different function. It had to be so obviously the product of superior aesthetic judgment that the absence of royal provenance stopped mattering in the room. A 116-carat cabochon emerald with a three-dimensional gold panther perched on top of it doesn't represent a dynasty. It represents a woman who knew exactly what she was commissioning and had the eye to commission it correctly. Those are different kinds of authority, but authority is what both of them are. The collection grew throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. A sustained accumulation from Cartier, Van Cleef and Arpels, and other houses that Wallis treated, one source noted, as something like her personal court. The total financial scale of Edward's jewelry spending over the full 35 years of exile isn't precisely documented in any single authoritative source. No historian has produced a confirmed aggregate figure. What the 1987 Geneva sale documents is the outcome. 306 catalog lots of the most significant pieces, organized into 311 items at auction, which sold at prices that reflected the market's unambiguous estimate of what the collection actually meant. The personal engravings drew the most extravagant premiums. A Royal Naval sword from 1913, inscribed to Edward when he was Prince of Wales, sold for $1.33 million, 133 times its pre-sale estimate. A Cartier gold pocket watch from 1939 engraved, "No excuse for going in the wrong direction, Easter 1939, fetched $467,000, 100 times the estimate. The pieces that were most personal, most specifically them, cost the most. The market understood what the engravings meant. The "we" motif, one more time. The "we" signature runs through the collection like a watermark. The engagement ring, the heart-shaped Cartier brooch with "WE" in emeralds and ruby X's, multiple other pieces carrying the intertwined initials across bracelets and brooches, commissioned over 3 decades. No confirmed total count of "we" monogrammed pieces exists in the formal record, but the pattern is unmistakable and evidently deliberate. A recurring design brief executed across different houses, different years, different forms. The pronoun and the monogram do different work. The monogram stakes a claim. These belong to Wallis and Edward. The pronoun makes an argument. There is a "we" here, a genuine unit, regardless of what the letter's patents say about whether one half of the unit deserves a royal title. The palace spent decades trying to establish that the Duchess of Windsor was a contingent figure, someone attached to a former royal by an unfortunate accident of his choice. The "WE" pieces, engraved in gold and worn daily for 35 years, maintained the counter-argument that the unit was primary, and the palace's opinions about it were secondary. "We are ours now" is the most loaded phrase in the collection. It was written in October 1936, before the Abdication, before the Exile, before the letters patent. Written when the catastrophe was still private, and the decision had already been made. Everything that followed, the flamingo, the panthers, the ruby suite, the cross bracelet with 9 dated stones, was evidence supporting the original claim. What it actually cost. By the early 1970s, the couple's life in Paris had contracted around Edward's declining health. He died on May 28, 1972, at the house in Neuilly, the former King of the United Kingdom, Emperor of India, gone at 77. He'd spent 36 years as an ex-king, wearing the title Duke that his brother's government had issued as a containment measure and a consolation at the same time. The last years of the marriage were difficult in ways the glamour photographs of the 1950s don't suggest. Edward died without the HRH question ever being resolved. The palace had never reversed the letter's patent. He'd petitioned, it hadn't moved. And then he was gone, and Wallis was alone in Neuilly with the collection and the staff and the house and the accumulated record of 35 years of an exile that had been, depending on who you asked, either a love story or a national embarrassment. She lived for another 14 years after Edward's death, and the quality of those years diminished steadily. By the early 1980s, she was largely unable to receive visitors, increasingly frail. Her world shrunk to the dimensions of the house in Neuilly. The woman who had pinned the flamingo brooch to her shoulder at formal dinners in Bermuda in 1940 was, by 1985, almost entirely isolated. She died on April 24, 1986. She was almost 90 years old. She died as the Duchess of Windsor, not Her Royal Highness. The title she'd been denied the day before her wedding was still denied at the time of her death. The palace had held that position for 49 years, through the reigns of 2 monarchs and across every petition Edward had filed. It never moved. 11 months later, the collection arrived in Geneva. What the 1987 auction measured was a specific question. What was the collection, separated from the people who had built it, actually worth to the world? The answer had nothing to do with the palace's position on the matter. The world record the sale set wasn't a verdict on royal protocol. It was the market's assessment of what 35 years of accumulated intention, objects engraved, dated, co-designed, worn daily, carried into every room as the evidence of a particular argument, turns out to be worth when the people who made it are no longer there to make the argument themselves. The objects spoke for themselves. They've been doing that since 1936. The cost, in one sense, is the obvious one: a throne. The most powerful individual office in an empire that, at the time of the abdication, still covered a quarter of the Earth's surface. Edward gave that up at 42, and he never held power again. Whether that constitutes a tragedy or a clarification depends on what you think the throne was for. The engravings suggest he'd made that accounting privately, weeks before anyone else knew the abdication was coming, and had arrived at a conclusion he was confident enough to cut into platinum. We are ours now. October 27, 1936. A man who still wore a crown, proposing to a woman in secret, recording the decision in metal. In the other sense, the one Geneva answered 11 months after Wallis died, the collection cost $50.3 million. That's the world's final assessment of what the Windsor Exile had produced. Not the palace's assessment, not the official biographies' assessment. 1,000 bidders on the shore of a Swiss lake, competing for what she had kept, arriving at a world record. The proceeds went to the Pasteur Institute in Paris for research into global diseases including AIDS, the most extravagant private jewelry collection of the 20th century. Assembled across 35 years of exile and defiance, liquidated into medical research. Edward had stipulated this before he died. Whether you read that as dignity or as a final gesture of irrelevance toward the British establishment that had produced all of it, both readings are available, and neither cancels the other. The panther bracelet from 1952 sold at a follow-up Sotheby's auction in 2010 and set a new world record as the most expensive bracelet ever sold at auction. 58 years after Cartier finished it in Paris, the articulated animal was still stalking. The flamingo is in the estate of Elizabeth Taylor, who understood what she was acquiring. The W.E. emerald, redesigned in 1958 and worn for 50 years after the proposal it commemorated, changed hands in Geneva in 1987 and carries the same 12 characters it carried in October 1936. The British establishment never gave Wallis the title. The letters patent were never reversed. That's the official record, and it's permanent. But the engravings are permanent too. My Wallis from Her David, the 19th of June, 1936. In a ruby suite Van Cleef and Arpels made when Edward was still king and using his private name because she knew him that way. Hold tight. 40 Burmese rubies assembled into a bracelet and sent to a woman in a villa in Cannes, surrounded by police and photographers, with 2 words on the inside. 9 crosses in platinum, dated and colored, for the significant passages of 10 years that the official record declined to acknowledge. The collection is the confession. The palace wrote the official history. Edward and Wallis wrote theirs in gold. Subscribe for more stories like this.